clashes erupted between Ngozi Orabueze's newly armed group and the Biafra Liberation Army, BLA, in Arandizu, resulting in many deaths and escalating internal tensions within the Biafran independence movement. The critic accuses certain Igbo people of betraying the freedom struggle by supporting splinter groups and ignoring warnings about these internal threats. Commander Oki Sophia, associated with Ngozi Orabueze's group and identified as a key figure in this new faction, led an armed confrontation against the original BLA. The critic insists this conflict is not part of the legitimate fight for Biafra freedom, but rather a destructive civil strife within Biafra, which only serves to weaken their cause. A past memo is referenced where the speaker had warned that a new army was being formed without proper training or structure, predicting this internal confrontation almost 2 months before it happened. He questions the loyalty of the new faction, asking whether their true mission is to fight Nigeria's army or to undermine the original BLA and Eastern Security Network, ESN, established by Mazi Nnamdi Kanu. Concerns are raised that some Biafrans are funding and supporting this splinter group, potentially aiding enemies of the movement and risking Simon Ekpa's safety and freedom abroad. The critic laments that instead of confronting the Nigerian state and Fulani herdsmen terrorists, Biafrans are now fighting each other, destabilizing their own land and movement. He criticizes the decision to open a new Biafra embassy in Washington, questioning why the existing one in Maryland, funded and built in 2023, is now being rendered useless. He expresses deep frustration with internal betrayals, the division of loyalties, and how personal ambitions and misguidance are endangering the entire Biafra liberation struggle. I remember the first time I heard about the vision of a free Biafra, the hope that flickered in the hearts of so many people from the eastern region of what is now the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Back then it felt like a distant dream, but in the minds of those who longed for self-determination, that dream burned brightly. I found myself drawn into conversations with activists who spoke of justice, of a future where the Igbo people could govern themselves, free from perceived marginalization. Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, a figure who would come to embody that struggle, carried that dream on his shoulders, rallying supporters with fiery speeches and the promise that the Eastern Security Network, anchored by the Biafra Liberation Army, would stand ready to defend their cause. On the 23rd day of April in the year 2025, I sat down in my living room and tuned into the Biafra channel television broadcast. The opening scene was stark and unsettling. Armed men in combat gear standing in a dusty clearing in Arandizu, their weapons glinting in the harsh sunlight. It was immediately clear that something had gone terribly wrong. What I saw was not a clash between freedom fighters and the Nigerian army or the notorious Fulani herdsmen militias. Instead, it was a confrontation between two groups that claimed allegiance to the same banner. The newly armed force led by Ngozi Orabueze, a woman whose name I had heard only in passing, stood toe-to-toe with the Biafra Liberation Army, the very entity founded by Mazi Nnamdi Kanu and supported by the Eastern Security Network. Among the commanders of Ngozi Orabueze's group was Commander Oki Sophia, a name that rang loud in the cacophony of gunshots and shouted orders. When I saw Commander Oki Sophia's face on the screen, I felt a chill because I realized that the internal tensions I had sensed for months were about to boil over into open violence. In that moment, watching the images flicker across my screen, I felt a deep sorrow. Here were people who once marched under a common flag, who once shared the same dream of an independent Biafra. Instead of directing their struggle toward the Nigerian state and the Fulani herdsman groups who had long terrorized communities in the Sahel, they turned their weapons inward. Video clips showed armed men from both factions firing at each other, taking cover behind walls and abandoned vehicles. The sound of rifle fire and shouted commands echoed through the broadcast, but it was not the sound of freedom. It was the sound of ruin. Even as the images rolled, the anchor's voice cut through the static, urging viewers to pay close attention. He reminded everyone listening that this was not the legitimate struggle for Biafra liberation. Instead, it was a destructive, self-inflicted civil strife that threatened to weaken the entire movement. I felt the weight of those words. Having followed the saga of the Biafra cause for years, I understood how delicate a coalition it had always been. Various splinter groups, each convinced that they held the true vision, had emerged over time, but this was the first time I had seen such violent confrontation between factions that claimed the same identity. As I leaned forward, the anchor began to narrate a memo he had released nearly 2 months earlier, a document that now seemed almost prophetic. In that memo, he warned that a new army was being formed outside the established structures of the Biafra Liberation Army. He cautioned that young recruits, lacking guerrilla warfare experience, had been given weapons after only a few weeks of rudimentary training. He asked whether their true mission was to face down the Nigerian army or to undermine the original Biafra Liberation Army and the Eastern Security Network created by Mazi Nnamdi Kanu. Listening to him speak those words again, I felt a shiver as I realized how accurately he had anticipated this tragedy. The anchor's innermost frustration shone through when he asked a pointed question. Why were some Biafrans, perhaps driven by personal ambition or financial gain, funding and supporting this splinter group? He feared that resources meant 264309 to challenge the Nigerian state were being diverted to fuel a fight against fellow Igbo people. Worse still, he worried that these internal divisions could jeopardize the safety and freedom of Simon Ekpa, who remained in exile abroad after his controversial activism in Europe. I have met supporters of Simon Ekpa in person, and I know how deeply they care for his well-being. The thought that internal rivalries might put him at risk filled me with dread. Throughout the broadcast, the anchor's tone grew more urgent, more personal. He lamented that instead of confronting the Fulani herdsman terrorists who had been attacking villages from the northeastern Sahel to the southern states of Enugu and Abia, Biafrans were now embroiled in internecine warfare. He reminded viewers of the broader mission to secure justice, to protect lives, to build a society where the Igbo people could flourish. Every gunshot fired in Arandizu, he said, was a setback to that mission. It was a betrayal of every precious life lost at the hands of external enemies, now wasted in a conflict that served no one's freedom. Then he turned to another development that struck me as equally baffling. He criticized the decision to open a new Biafra diplomatic mission in the United States capital of Washington, D.C. He asked why resources were being poured into establishing yet another embassy when a fully funded modern Biafra headquarters had been built only 2 years earlier in Baltimore, Maryland. I recalled the ceremonies in 2023 when Mazi Nnamdi Kanu and senior members of the movement had celebrated the opening of that Maryland facility as the first official representation of Biafra overseas. It was meant to serve as a platform for advocacy, for raising awareness in diplomatic circles, for hosting cultural events. Now, instead of building on that foundation, yet more money and effort were being diverted to another location. The anchor warned that such fragmentation of diplomatic efforts mirrored the fragmentation on the battlefield, and it would only make the movement appear weak and divided in the eyes of the world. He concluded his address with a deep sense of frustration and resolve. He spoke directly to the hearts of Biafrans, wherever they might be watching. He reminded them that personal ambitions and misguidance could destroy everything that had been achieved through years of activism and sacrifice. He urged them to remember the true goal, a free and democratic republic of Biafra, where every Igbo man, every Igbo woman, every displaced person could return home in dignity. He called on leaders of all factions to lay down their arms and to unite under the original ideals embodied by Mazi Nnamdi Kanu and the Eastern Security Network. I felt a lump in my throat as I heard those final words. I remembered late nights spent reading about the Biafran War nearly half a century ago, when tens of thousands of lives were lost in a struggle that also ended in tragedy. I thought of the mothers I had interviewed who still carried scars, both physical and emotional, from that conflict. I thought of the children born into a generation of pain, longing for a chance at peace. The clash in Arandizu seemed to me like history repeating itself, a cycle of violence that fed on division rather than hope. After the broadcast ended, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I wondered how many lives had been lost that day in Arandizu. I imagined families torn apart, mothers wailing as they searched for missing sons, brothers who once fought side by side now lying wounded or dead in makeshift hospitals. I thought of Commander Oki Sophia, whose allegiance to Ngozi Orabueze's faction had driven her to challenge the very army that once promised her freedom. I thought of Ngozi Orabueze herself, whose journey from civilian to leader of an armed group must have been wrought with doubt and desperation. What had compelled her to take up arms against her own people? Was it a genuine belief that the original movement had lost its way, or was it the lure of power, the thrill of command? In the days that followed, news outlets around the world picked up the story. Journalists interviewed eyewitnesses who spoke of checkpoints hastily erected by the new faction, of young recruits patrolling roads with little more than single days of training under their belts. Reports described how the Biafra Liberation Army had mobilized its veteran fighters, sending urgent pleas for reinforcements to camps in remote forest enclaves. I read analyses that warned of a prolonged guerrilla conflict, a war within a war that could drag on indefinitely and bleed the movement dry. All of them echoed the same central theme. This was not the struggle for Biafra liberation. It was a fight among Igbo people, and it threatened to destroy the very fabric of their unity. I found myself thinking late into the night about the anchor's words and the memo from 2 months earlier. He had written then that anyone funding this new army needed to ask themselves whether they were prepared to see their own people slaughtered in the streets of their homeland. He had warned that if the new faction's agenda was to undermine the Biafra Liberation Army or to lend credence to Nigerian propaganda that labeled the entire independence movement as criminal, then those financiers would bear the guilt for every life torn apart. He urged all supporters to step back, to observe, to stay calm and security conscious. Those words now felt like a dying plea. I reached out to friends who had been active in Biafran political circles. Some were adamant that Ngozi Orabueze's group had genuine grievances. They argued that under the original leadership, resources were mismanaged, that some voices were left unheard, and that radicals had hijacked the movement's agenda. Others insisted that this was no more than a power grab, a cynical ploy to weaken Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's influence abroad and to give ammunition to the Federal Republic of Nigeria's smear campaign. They pointed to the arrests and convictions of activists in Europe and North America as proof that any sign of disunity would be exploited by Nigeria's security services. As those debates raged in chat groups and on encrypted messaging apps, I realized that the situation had escalated far beyond April 23, 2025. By the time the dust settled in Arandizu, dozens of fighters lay dead on both sides. Some were recent recruits, barely out of their teens, their faces unlined and their futures stolen. Others were veterans of earlier skirmishes, men with scars from encounters with Nigerian soldiers and vigilantes. I thought of the Eastern Security Network camps hidden in the forests of Imo and Anambra states, training grounds where men learned to survive in harsh terrain. Those camps now faced the prospect of being overrun, not by an external army, but by a faction that claimed the same cause. In that moment, it became painfully clear to me that the internal divisions had reached a breaking point. If the Biafra cause was to survive, its leaders had to find a way to reconcile. The anchor's broadcast closed with a heartfelt appeal for dialogue, for sober reflection on shared history, and for the guidance of elders who remembered the sacrifices of the past. He called on Ngozi Orabueze and her commanders, including Commander Oki Sophia, to lay down their arms and return to the negotiating table. He asked the leadership of the Biafra Liberation Army to embrace forgiveness, to welcome back any who had been led astray, and to strengthen the original structures rather than abandon them. I confess that as I listened, I felt both hopeful and despairing at once. Hopeful because the spark of unity still flickered, alive in the words of those who refused to see the movement torn apart. Despairing because I knew how deep the wounds ran and how easily external forces could exploit them. The Federal Republic of Nigeria's government had long portrayed the Biafran struggle as extremist and punitive. Now it could point to the clash in Arandizu as proof that the movement was inherently unstable. International sympathizers might recoil at reports of Igbo people killing Igbo people, and diplomatic doors that had been ajar could slam shut. In the weeks that followed, there were tentative overtures toward a ceasefire. Mediators, including respected community elders and church leaders, stepped forward to broker talks. Messages were exchanged between commanders via phone calls and encrypted texts. Rumors circulated that Ngozi Orabueze had met secretly with senior figures from the Eastern Security Network to discuss terms. Yet progress was slow and fragile. Skirmishes flared up when mistrust ran too high. Suspicion lingered that some financiers withdrew support from one side only to funnel it into covert operations against the other. Through it all, I found myself returning to that April 23rd broadcast. I replayed the anchor's words in my mind, as if seeking guidance through the static of betrayal and ambition. I thought of the children growing up in villages on the borderlands, who once saw in the Biafra flag a promise of security and dignity. Now they faced the grim reality that their protectors might turn on them in the crossfire. I thought of the mothers who had survived the famine of the late 1960s, and how they could scarcely bear the thought that their grandchildren might endure the same cruelty, inflicted not by a foreign army, but by their own people. And yet, despite everything, I held on to a cautious optimism. I believed that the fundamental yearning for self-determination, for justice, for a society that honored every human life, was stronger than any splinter group or internal rivalry. I believed that if leaders on all sides could remember the core ideals that had brought them together, respect for human dignity, for equality under the law, for economic opportunity and cultural pride, they could rediscover a path forward. Perhaps it would require painful concessions, telling apologies, and a reckoning with the deeper causes of mistrust. But I believed it was possible. Today, as I share this narrative with you, I urge anyone who cares for the people of the eastern region of Nigeria, for the Igbo community, and for the vision of a free and democratic Biafra, to hold fast to that hope. Let us remember that the struggle began with a dream of unity and self-governance, not with hatred or vengeance. Let us honor the memory of those who fell fighting external foes by refusing to let internal divisions undo their sacrifice. And let us call on every leader, whether in the Biafra Liberation Army, in Ngozi Orabueze's faction, in the offices of diaspora envoys in Maryland and Washington, D.C., or in the halls of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, to choose dialogue over gunfire, reconciliation over rivalry. Because in the end, the true sound of freedom is not that of rifles or mortar fire. It is the sound of people coming together, raising their voices in harmony, and building a future where every man, every woman, and every child can live with dignity and peace. That is the legacy worth fighting for, and it is a legacy that no internal conflict should ever conquer. In the weeks following the deadly clash in Arandizu, I reflected on how internal strife inflicts wounds deeper than any single battle. A teacher named Ifeoma Okiki wrote to me from a village school near Owerri. She described her 10-year-old pupil, Chukwemeka, who tearfully wondered why Igbo people were fighting one another instead of fulfilling their mission against Fulani herdsmen. His question reminded me that the real victims of this conflict are innocent children who have lost faith in justice and unity. I spoke next with Chief Benjamin Nwosu in Umuahia, who had tried to prevent this very clash. As early as a month before the guns spoke, he convened elders to bring Ngozi Orabueze's new faction into the established ranks of the Eastern Security Network. He warned that untrained recruits and hasty action would play into the hands of the Nigerian government. He explained that true guerrilla warfare demands discipline, popular support, and moral authority, not simply armed confrontation. His counsel went unheeded until the first shots rang out. In Abuja, the federal authorities used the footage from Arandizu to brand the entire Biafra movement criminal. In Lagos, barrister Adaora Chukwu, a human rights lawyer, prepared a brief for the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. She cautioned that equating this internal incident with the broader struggle for self-determination would drown out the movement's legitimate grievances. She reminded me of the world's failure to grasp the cry for justice during the Biafran War of the 1960s and warned that history must not repeat itself. Across the Atlantic, the diaspora felt the tension. In London, student activist Chinyere Ume told me her University of London town hall ended in heated argument rather than unity. Some attendees supported Ngozi Orabueze's faction's call for resource transparency. Others accused her of undermining Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's leadership. Emails once full of solidarity now brimmed with bitterness, risking fractured morale among students in Europe. In Washington, D.C., former Nigerian diplomat Ambassador Ifedayo Akinwale observed that the Maryland Biafra headquarters, opened in 2023, had served as a focal point for cultural exchange and dialogue. The plan for a second mission in the U.S. Capitol struck him as redundant and damaging. On the day Arandizu went viral, the Maryland office called for calm and unity. Yet lobbyists for Ngozi Orabueze's group in D.C. demanded exclusive recognition, revealing how diplomatic representation had splintered. Back in eastern Nigeria, ordinary citizens bore the brunt of this infighting. Near Enugu, Emmanuel Onyekachi recounted how armed youths manning makeshift checkpoints searched his bag, accused him of espionage, and forced him to carry a suspicious package under threat of a pistol. His humiliation, he said, cost him the little savings he had left. His story was one of many, as civilians suffered at the hands of those who claimed to protect them. Against this bleak background, Reverend Dr. Emeka Ofulue of Onitsha offered a path toward reconciliation. He invited leaders from both factions to join a peace walk along the river Niger, framing it as a spiritual pilgrimage grounded in Igbo traditions of communal decision-making. Ngozi Orabueze sent her advisor, Ifeanyi Nweke, who demanded a full audit of diaspora funds dating back to 2023. The Biafra Liberation Army dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Chidibere Eze and Captain Nnamdi Azubuike, veterans with Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's blessing. At sunrise, under swaying palm trees, they walked together, bowed their heads in prayer, and shared stories of fallen comrades. Under a canopy of mango trees, they spoke candidly of fears and regrets. They agreed to form an audit committee to share training resources and to rename joint patrols Biafra Community Watch, protecting farmers instead of harassing civilians. In the months that followed, community centers in Port Harcourt hosted former fighters in workshops on empathy and forgiveness. Amarachi Nweke of the Biafra Liberation Army and Ezina Okoro of Ngozi Orabueze's group sat side by side, learning to listen and to heal. Their stories convinced me that the true struggle is not over land or power, but over the soul of a movement. As I prepared to leave Nigeria, I carried a cautious hope. Real peace will demand honesty, humility, and a steadfast commitment to the common good. Yet I saw that the shared longing for dignity, justice, and self-determination endures. in the voices of teachers, elders, diplomats, and former combatants alike. In the end, freedom will belong not to the banners we raise, but to the unity we forge out of our differences. This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.